The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like trapped insects as Laura Bennett clocked in at 11:22 p.m., her badge clicking softly against the laminate timecard. St. Michael's Hospital in Houston never truly slept, it just shifted into a different kind of alertness, the kind where everything moved slower but nothing was ever truly quiet. The night shift began with the smell of stale coffee and antiseptic, two scents that had become as familiar to her as gun oil and desert sand, though she would never say that out loud. 3 months. She had been at St. Michael's for exactly 94 days, and in that time she had become the kind of nurse nobody noticed. Not because she was incompetent, quite the opposite. She was methodical, precise, invisible in the way that made her dangerous to anyone watching too closely. But nobody was watching. That was the entire point of the assignment. Captain James Reynolds lay in Recovery Room 4, his left leg elevated and stabilized, his medical chart fat with post-operative notes from the thoracic surgery team. He was the reason she was here. Intelligence from the Naval Criminal Investigative Service had placed him at St. Michael's 6 weeks ago with shrapnel wounds from a firefight in Marjah, Afghanistan, wounds that should have ended his career but hadn't. The real reason Reynolds needed protection was classified 3 levels above her clearance, but she knew the essential fact: he possessed information about a procurement corruption ring that stretched into civilian medical facilities, and somebody inside this hospital knew he had it. Laura pushed a medication cart down the corridor, her movements economical and unhurried. Her hands were steady, hands that had held a tourniquet on a dying Marine's thigh in 2019, hands that had performed needle decompression in a sandstorm, hands that had learned long ago that trembling was a luxury she could not afford. The scars on her knuckles, barely visible under the fluorescent lights, told stories she would never speak aloud. A thin line across her left palm from shrapnel. A burn mark on her right wrist from a field medical kit gone wrong in Kandahar. The kind of marks that a registered nurse might acquire through accident or carelessness, if anyone ever bothered to ask. She did not expect anyone to ask. The night nurse station occupied the north wing of the 3rd floor, a cramped territory of beige walls and computer terminals that hummed with the same monotonous frequency as the lights. 2 other nurses worked the graveyard shift with her, Michelle, who had been at St. Michael's for 7 years and treated the night shift like a slow-motion dance she had perfected, and Derek, a new hire who still moved with the nervous energy of someone afraid of making mistakes. Neither of them paid much attention to Laura. She was competent but forgettable, the kind of colleague you realized you had worked with only when you checked the schedule to see who was covering your days off. That was exactly how Laura needed it. She pulled Reynolds' chart and reviewed the post-operative notes with the kind of attention that would have seemed routine to anyone passing by. But her eyes caught things. Small things. Discrepancies in the supply logs attached to his surgical record. The thoracic surgery had required a specific combination of specialized equipment, a 36 French chest tube, a satin sky clamp, a level 1 rapid infuser set. The quantities documented didn't match the quantities actually used. The charges on his bill showed 3 units of something called a surgical assist module that Laura had worked in enough operating rooms to know didn't exist as a billable item. She made a note in her personal log. Not the hospital log. Never the hospital log. That log went into her secure messaging app encrypted with 256-bit encryption, synced to a secure server maintained by NCIS. Dr. Caldwell arrived on the 3rd floor at 1:23 a.m., moving through the corridor with the kind of confidence that only came from knowing you owned the place. He was tall, with the kind of expensive watch that made a point, a Rolex that cost more than most nurses made in 3 months, and he carried himself like a man who had never been questioned about anything in his entire life. He was the attending surgeon on Reynolds' case, the one whose signature appeared on all the post-operative reports, the one whose name was on the door of an office on the 4th floor with a view of the parking lot. Laura watched him approach the nurse station without appearing to watch him at all. This was a skill she had cultivated over 17 years of classified work, the ability to observe someone while seeming completely focused on something else. Michelle looked up from her computer. Derek straightened unconsciously, the way junior staff did around senior physicians. Laura continued reviewing Reynolds' medication schedule, her posture unchanged, her breathing even. Caldwell did not appear to register Laura's presence at all. He spoke directly to Michelle, his voice carrying the smooth cadence of someone accustomed to compliance. "I need Captain Reynolds' chart. I want to do a rounds check before I leave for the night." Michelle handed it over immediately. Laura noticed that Caldwell did not say please. He did not need to. The chart changed hands, and then he paused, his eyes moving down the desk and landing on Laura with the kind of casual dismissal that was worse than actual hostility. It was the look of a man noticing a piece of furniture that did not quite match the rest of the room. "You're new," he said. "Not a question." Laura looked up from her own paperwork, her expression neutral. 3 months, Dr. Caldwell. "And you're doing what, exactly?" "Medication verification and post-operative monitoring for my assigned patients." He waited, as if expecting her to elaborate. When she did not, his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Laura had seen that small muscle spasm before, in various forms, on the faces of men who were not accustomed to brief answers. Men who expected deference. Men who expected nurses to ask permission to breathe. "Well," Caldwell said finally, "try to stay out of the way. Dr. Harrison and I have a complex treatment plan in place for Captain Reynolds. Last thing we need is someone new to the hospital introducing complications." Laura nodded once. "Understood." He left with Reynolds' chart in hand, moving toward recovery room 4 with the same confident stride. Laura waited exactly 2 minutes, then made a note of the timestamp and what Caldwell had taken. Not because it was suspicious in itself, attending physicians reviewed their own patient charts all the time. But because she had read the post-operative summary that morning, and she had seen no notation indicating that Caldwell planned to do evening rounds. The chart should have been filed in medical records. Instead, he had taken it personally. Michelle glanced over at Laura. "Don't take the Caldwell thing personally. He's like that with everyone new." "I'm not worried," Laura said, which was technically true. Worry implied uncertainty about outcome, and she had spent too many years in situations where the outcome was determined by the quality of her decisions under pressure to afford herself the luxury of worry. She had, however, become very interested in Dr. Caldwell. She completed her medication rounds, checking full lines and cardiac monitors with the kind of meticulous attention that was her trademark. In recovery room 2, she verified a patient's oxygen saturation, 92%, good, stable. In recovery room 3, she adjusted the positioning of a post-op hip replacement patient and confirmed the epidural pump was delivering medication at the correct dose. Everything routine. Everything precise. When she reached recovery room 4, she found Caldwell standing over Reynolds' bed, studying the chart with an intensity that seemed excessive for a routine check. Reynolds was conscious but medicated, his eyes open but unfocused. He did not appear to notice Caldwell's presence. Laura noted the foresight on Reynolds' left arm, still clean, no swelling, and the chest drainage tube securing properly. She said nothing to Caldwell, simply performing her checks with the same methodical care. Caldwell did not leave. He stood there, watching her work, and Laura felt the specific weight of his attention in a way that registered as a change in atmospheric pressure. This was the moment where the civilian world and the operational world intersected, where cover and reality rubbed against each other. She kept her hand steady. She kept her breathing even. She did not make eye contact. "Captain Reynolds has a standing order for pain management every 4 hours, Caldwell said finally. "I'd prefer if someone with more experience handled his medications." Laura looked at him then, her expression perfectly neutral. "I'm certified in for administration. I can call for a senior nurse if you prefer, but the protocols are clear." "Just see that it gets done correctly," he said, and then he left, taking the chart with him again. That night, after her shift ended at 7:15 a.m. and she had handed off her patients to the day shift nurses, Laura sat in her car in the parking lot for exactly 6 minutes before driving home. In that time, she made 2 encrypted messages to her handler. The first noted the discrepancies in Reynolds' billing. The second noted Caldwell's behavior, specifically, the fact that he had removed Reynolds' chart from the station twice in one shift, and the fact that he had specifically requested that she not be the one administering Reynolds' medications. It was not much. But Laura had been trained to read small movements the way other people read books. Small movements were how you survived. Small movements were how you identified threats before they identified you. She drove through Houston's early morning traffic, past the green highway signs and the coffee shops opening for the day shift, and thought about the fact that Caldwell had looked at her the way you looked at something that was in your way. And that was fine. That was actually perfect. Because the one thing Dr. Caldwell did not know about the new nurse on his night shift was that she had spent the last 3 months becoming very, very good at noticing things, and she had just become very, very interested in what he was hiding. 3 months into her assignment at St. Michael's, Laura Bennett had learned that hospitals ran on routine and gossip in equal measure. The night shift was her kingdom, fewer witnesses, skeleton crew, the kind of isolation that let her move through the building like she belonged there. She did belong there. That was the problem. Dr. Caldwell had figured out that the new nurse was trouble on day 47. He made his announcement in the cafeteria at 6:41 a.m., voice loud enough to carry across the stainless steel counters and white tile floors where the day shift was arriving for their coffee. Laura was standing 3 tables away, reviewing a chart, her scrub still crisp from the night. She didn't look up. But she heard every word. $20 says the new girl quits within a week, Caldwell said to the cluster of residents and nurses gathered around him. He was holding a coffee cup that probably cost more than Laura's monthly rent, his white coat draped over his shoulders like a cape. She's got that look. The fragile type. Night shift gets to them. Someone laughed. Then someone else. Laura turned a page on the chart. Her hands were steady. Her pulse hadn't moved. "I'll take that bet," one of the senior nurses said. "Michelle. Been here 8 years. Knew every corner of this hospital's politics. She's tougher than she looks." "Is she?" Caldwell's smile was the kind you saw in sharks before they ate. "We'll see how tough she is after she understands what this job actually requires." Laura closed the chart. She set it on the table. She walked toward the exit with the same measured pace she would have used in a combat zone, head level, shoulders relaxed, nothing in her movements that suggested she'd heard a single word. But Caldwell wasn't done. She was halfway across the cafeteria, her tray balanced in one hand, eggs, toast, black coffee, nothing that would slow her down if she needed to move fast when she felt the impact. Not a collision. Deliberate. His shoulder caught her tray from the side, and the plate tipped, sliding across the plastic surface as eggs and toast scattered across the white floor. The coffee cup followed, hitting the tile with a crack that echoed through the room. The cafeteria went quiet. Not the normal quiet of a room with ambient noise. The silence of predators noticing a challenge to the hierarchy. Caldwell stood there with his coffee still in hand, that same shark smile spread across his face. Around them, the day shift stopped moving. Stopped talking. The fluorescent lights above buzzed their mechanical song, and nobody interrupted them. "Oops," Caldwell said. His voice was low enough that only Laura could hear clearly. "Careful with those trays." Laura didn't move. Didn't look at him. She set her remaining cup down on a nearby table and crouched to gather the scattered food. Her movements were precise, economical. A paper towel from the dispenser. She wiped the tile where the coffee had splashed, working from the center outward, the way someone trained to clean crime scenes would do it. That's when Caldwell escalated. He pulled a patient chart from under his arm, the file for Captain Reynolds in room for 12, and tossed it onto the wet floor beside her. Not dropped. Tossed. The kind of deliberate gesture that made the message unmistakable. His shadow fell across her as she crouched there, surrounded by an audience that had learned long ago not to interfere. "Pick that up, sweetheart," he said. The words hung in the air like smoke. Laura's jaw tightened. Just slightly. A muscle worked once beneath her skin. Then she reached for the chart, her hand moving with the same surgical precision she'd used for the coffee-stained tile. She gathered the papers that had scattered from the folder, checking each one, making sure nothing was missing. Organization. Control. Not a wasted motion. Around the room, she heard the whispers starting. "Did you see that? He actually just..." She didn't even. Michelle, the senior nurse, had her arms crossed. Her expression had shifted from amusement to something colder. She was calculating, deciding whether Caldwell had made a mistake or whether this was how things worked now. Laura stood. The chart was back together, the floor was clean, the scattered breakfast had been reduced to a memory. She turned toward the exit without acknowledging Caldwell, without meeting anyone's eyes. Her posture was unchanged. Her breathing was unchanged. If anyone had been monitoring her pupils, they would have measured no dilation, no sign of the spike in adrenaline that her body had released and reabsorbed in the span of 6 seconds. Caldwell watched her walk away with the expression of someone who'd just thrown a punch and found nothing to hit. He'd been testing her. Trying to crack the surface, looking for trembling hands or a voice that broke or tears that would give him something to use. What he got instead was absolute stillness. The silence was the worst part for him. Silence meant he hadn't won. By the time she reached the stairwell, the cafeteria had resumed its normal rhythm. The bet had been placed. The dominance had been asserted. Everyone understood the hierarchy now. Everyone except Laura, who didn't care about hierarchies at all. The rest of the morning shift went exactly as planned. Charts reviewed. Captain Reynolds's vitals checked. The Navy captain was recovering well from his injury sustained in Marjah, his color improving, his appetite returning. He was a strong man in a weakened body. Exactly the kind of patient who needed someone watching for the details that could turn recovery into catastrophe. It was during the 2:13 p.m. examination that everything shifted. Routine post-operative assessment. Caldwell had already finished his morning rounds and left the hospital, which meant the senior ER doctor, Marcus Chen, was handling the afternoon evaluations. Chen was old school. 32 years in medicine. Combat experience from a disaster relief mission to Afghanistan in 2011. The kind of doctor who noticed things because he'd learned that details saved lives. Captain Reynolds was sitting up in bed, breathing easily, the surgical dressing on his abdomen clean and dry. Chen was checking the sutures when he asked Reynolds to take a deep breath and hold it. Standard procedure. Nothing remarkable. Except Laura noticed that the captain's breathing was shallow on the left side, favoring the right. A compensatory pattern. Pain, maybe, or something else. She moved beside the bed without being asked. Her hands came up to the captain's rib cage with a confidence that made Chen pause. She applied pressure, testing each rib, her fingers reading the bone beneath the skin like braille. When she reached the 4th rib on the left side, Reynolds winced. Laura's hand stilled. She moved to the captain's shoulder, adjusted his position slightly, and then walked him through a breathing technique that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than a hospital training manual. The kind of breathing that came from field stabilization protocols. The kind of breathing you taught someone when you needed them conscious and functional in a combat zone. Chen was watching her. Really watching her. His eyes had narrowed, tracking her movements, noting the way her hands moved with something that resembled muscle memory. Not the tentative movements of a nurse following protocol. The precise, economical movements of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. When they stepped out of the room, Chen closed the door behind them. For a moment, he just looked at her. His expression was unreadable, but his voice when he spoke was barely above a whisper. "I saw someone do that exact procedure in Kandahar," he said. Stabilizing a Marine with a pneumothorax. Hands moving exactly like that. The way you angled him, the breathing technique. It was, he paused, something shifting in his eyes. A question forming. "You're not just a nurse, are you?" Laura's expression didn't change. Her hands didn't shake. She turned toward the medication cart with the same unhurried pace she used for everything, and when she spoke, her voice was level as water. "I'm exactly what my ID badge says I am," she replied. But Chen didn't look away. He was seeing something now, something that had clicked into place behind his eyes. The way she moved. The way she noticed things. The strange military-grade precision in a hospital setting that shouldn't exist unless someone had brought it there deliberately. He didn't press. That was the thing about Chen. He knew when to ask questions and when to let things sit. But he'd started watching now. Started noticing. And in a hospital where Dr. Caldwell was building an entire empire on people not noticing things, that was exactly as dangerous as a loaded gun in the wrong hands. Laura finished her shift at 7:38 a.m. She changed out of her scrubs, collected her bag, and drove home through Houston traffic that moved like blood through clogged arteries. Her apartment was small and sparse, the way she kept everything temporary. But on the kitchen counter, beside the coffee maker, sat a pair of worn combat boots. Desert tan. Scuffed. The soles were separating at the heel, and the leather was cracked in places where sand and blood had worn through years ago. She picked them up and turned them over in her hands. Marjah, 2019. 3 tours. 47 confirmed saves. A scar on her right shoulder where shrapnel from an IED had been meant for Captain Reynolds but had found her instead. The boots were the only thing from her old life that she'd kept. Everything else had been erased. New social security number. New background. New references that would hold up to any investigation because the people providing them were trained liars with access to classified databases. But the boots stayed. She set them on the shelf beside her bed and lay down for 4 hours of sleep. No dreams. Just the absence of waking. When she opened her eyes at 11:51 a.m., the afternoon sun was moving across her wall like a searchlight, and she could already hear her daughter's voice calling from the living room, asking if Mommy was awake. That was the part that made everything harder. The little girl who asked questions Laura couldn't answer. The daughter who thought her mom worked nights at a hospital and came home tired. Who didn't know that before the hospital, there had been deserts and gunfire and a version of her mother that was trained to do things most people would never have to comprehend. Caldwell didn't know about the daughter. That was good. That meant she had leverage he didn't understand. But it also meant she had something to lose that he would absolutely use if he ever figured out what she was protecting. And he was already starting to notice that the new nurse didn't break. He was already activating his network, making calls to people who owed him favors, looking for ways to apply pressure in places where pressure might actually work. 2 days later, the routine exam became something else entirely. Captain Reynolds lay on the examination table in Bay 3, his vitals stable, his recovery tracking exactly where it should be. Laura stood at the monitor, checking his post-surgical numbers one more time before discharge paperwork. Routine. Clean. Simple. The kind of shift where nothing happened and everyone went home at the right time. Then his monitor flatlined. 1 second the rhythm was there. Steady. Reliable. The next second, a straight line and a sound like a door slamming. His body went rigid. The EKG showed nothing. Asystole. His heart had simply stopped. Code blue, Bay 3. Code blue, Bay 3. The overhead speaker crackled the announcement. Nurses scattered. A crash cart wheeled in, its cabinet doors swinging open like a broken jaw. Someone called for the on-call surgeon. Dr. Morrison. He was 23 minutes out, stuck in traffic on the 610, and nobody could reach him yet. The ER resident, Dr. Patterson, fumbled for the defibrillation paddles. His hand shook. Laura watched his movements, sloppy, panicked, the kind of muscle memory that only knew textbook responses. He'd never seen a patient arrest this way. Never felt the weight of those 3 seconds where hesitation becomes death. Stand back, Laura said. Not a request. Not a question. A command, and her voice had dropped an octave in 2 words. Something shifted in the room. The veteran ER doctor, Marcus Chen, the one who'd seen her work before, he froze. He heard it too. Laura was already moving. Her hands knew the geometry of this moment. Ribs. Intercostal space. The spot between the 5th and 6th rib where the needle went in at a 45-degree angle. She didn't reach for the paddles. She moved to the crash cart and pulled a surgical tray with movements that looked like they'd been rehearsed 1,000 times under desert sun. A 14-gauge needle. Local anesthetic. Scalpel in her right hand before anyone could process what was happening. I need a thoracotomy tray. Now. Her jaw was a line of concrete. Her voice carried the weight of someone who'd done this before a room full of blood and smoke, not fluorescent lights and tile floors. Dr. Patterson stepped back. Not because he understood. Because her presence had changed the air pressure in the room, and his body knew to move. Laura worked. The blade moved like water finding its path, precise and inevitable. 1 incision. 2. The ribs spreaded open with a low metallic hiss of the retractor. Beneath them, the heart sat exposed and still, a muscle that had forgotten its job. She didn't hesitate. Her hand went into his chest and she began the direct cardiac massage, her fingers working the ventricle with the kind of pressure that came from knowing exactly how hard you could push before everything broke. The observation windows above the bay filled with staff. Silently. Nurses. Residents. An attending physician who'd come to watch. They crowded together like spectators at a theater where they understood nothing of what they were seeing except that it was being done with absolute authority. O2 sat. Laura's voice never wavered. 68 and falling, someone said. Her hands moved faster. Pain was information. Pain was data. The rhythm of it, push, push, compress, feel for the response. No panicking. No second guessing. Just the steady work of bringing a man back from the edge of nothing. Push 1 milligram epi. 4. She didn't look up. The medication went in. Epinephrine to kick the heart's electrical system back online. Get me a 32 French chest tube. I need access to the pericardium. Marcus Chen was standing at her shoulder now. He'd worked enough cases to know not to get in her way, but close enough to hand her what she needed. The chest tube was already in his hand when she reached for it. The monitor showed a tremor. Not a rhythm yet. A whisper of electrical activity. 72 on the O2 Saturday. Climbing. Again, Laura said. Another push of epi. Her fingers continued the massage, feeling the heart's response beneath her hand, the way it wanted to start moving again, the way muscle memory, his body's memory of survival, was fighting back toward life. 79. 85. 88. The monitor showed something. A blip. A peak on the screen. Then another. Then a pattern forming. The heart was remembering how to beat. We've got sinus rhythm, Marcus said quietly. There was something like awe in his voice. BP climbing. 90 over 50. 92 over 55. Laura didn't celebrate. She was already working on the next thing, already thinking 3 moves ahead. She closed the incision with the kind of efficiency that belonged in a trauma unit in Marjah, not in a Houston hospital on a Tuesday morning. Every stitch purposeful. Every movement stripped down to its essential purpose. The entire observation window had gone silent. Not the kind of silence that comes from shock. The kind that comes when people are witnessing something they don't have words for yet. Captain Reynolds' eyes fluttered. His chest rose with breath. The monitor beeped its steady rhythm like a thing reborn. Marcus stepped closer. He was older, maybe 60, and his face had gone very still. That procedure, he said quietly. The way you access the pericardium. The precision of the compression points. I saw someone do that exact technique once. In Kandahar. Under fire. In a sandstorm so thick you couldn't see 6 inches in front of your face. Laura didn't answer. She was cleaning her hands at the sink, the blood washing down the drain in pink ribbons. Her hands were steady as a surgical laser. Not a tremor. Not a hesitation. You're not just a nurse, are you? Marcus said. Not a question anymore. A statement. A confirmation of something he'd been assembling in his mind since that first day, since the stabilization technique on the initial exam, since watching her move like someone who'd held lives together in conditions where there was no margin for error. She turned to him. Her eyes met his for exactly 2 seconds. Captain Reynolds is stable. He'll need intensive monitoring for the next 72 hours. The pericardial drainage will need to be checked every 2 hours. If there's any increase in output, escalate to the senior resident immediately. Laura? Those are your instructions, Doctor. Not harsh. Just absolute. The kind of tone that belonged to someone used to being obeyed. She stripped off her gloves. The observation window above the bay was still packed with staff. Every face was turned toward her. Every eye asking a question she wasn't going to answer. Not yet. The fluorescent lights hummed their electric frequency. Someone's shoes squeaked on the tile. The heart monitor beeped its steady rhythm, proof of concept, proof that whatever she was, whatever she'd done, it had worked. What they didn't know was that Dr. Caldwell was already in his office making phone calls. His office door closed with a soft click at 3:56 p.m., and Dr. Caldwell didn't waste a second. The phone was already in his hand, his contact list scrolling. 6 board members. 12 years of dinners at Ouzo Bay. 14 hospital galas where he'd quietly underwritten the silent auction. Investment portfolio diversification, he'd always called it. Insurance. Today, that insurance was going to work. The first call connected on the second ring. Richard, it's Marcus Caldwell. We need to talk about a staffing issue at St. Michael's. A nurse. Laura Bennett. Night shift. Yes, I'll wait while you pull her file. He picked up his pen, tapping it against the desk. The fluorescent overhead light buzzed. Her background doesn't hold up under scrutiny. I'm bringing in HR to document everything. I need to know the board's position before this becomes a liability issue. A pause. A low chuckle from the other end. Of course. Understood. I'll handle it. By 4:13 p.m., he'd made for more calls. Each board member promised discretion. Each one understood what was actually being said. The hospital's reputation was at stake, and Laura Bennett was suddenly a problem that needed solving. The 5th call went to a private investigative firm in Dallas. The one he'd used before when a nurse questioned his surgical supply orders 2 years ago. She'd transferred within a week. No formal complaint ever filed. I need a background verification on one of our staff. Everything. Check her references, her credentials, her employment history. Flag any gaps, any discrepancies, anything that doesn't line up. And I need preliminary findings by close of business tomorrow. He gave her personal cell number. Discretion is paramount. What Caldwell didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that 3 of Laura's 5 listed references were disconnected numbers. One was a pizza shop in Portsmouth. The investigator would find those gaps within hours. A fabricated work history has soft edges. Soft edges crack. At 4:51 p.m., he called an external HR investigator from a firm that specialized in hospital staff disputes. The kind of firm that asked no questions and filed reports that read like prosecution documents. I have concerns about a staff member's credentials and her judgment in clinical settings. She performed an unauthorized procedure today without proper authorization or supervision. I want that documented, investigated, and delivered to my office before her next shift. I want a clean paper trail. He paused. No, I don't anticipate she'll cooperate willingly. Prepare accordingly. By 5:28 p.m., the machinery was moving. Laura was still in the locker room when security arrived. Not the kind of security that escorted patients. The kind that escorted people out. 2 officers in navy blue with radios clipped to their belts. The lead officer, a man named Graves who'd worked St. Michael's for 9 years and had once thanked Laura for staying late to help his daughter through a panic attack in the ER, wouldn't meet her eyes. Ms. Bennett, we need your badge and your access card. Dr. Caldwell's orders. Effective immediately, you're on administrative suspension pending investigation. She didn't ask questions. She didn't argue. She simply unclipped her badge from her pocket and handed it over. The laminate was worn at the edges from 3 months of use. Her photo showed someone who looked almost like a stranger, more tired, more careful, more guarded. Understood, she said quietly. Down the corridor, Caldwell stood with his arms crossed. He'd positioned himself so she'd have to pass him on the way out. He didn't smile. He didn't need to. His posture said everything. I won. You're finished. And there's nothing you can do about it. Laura walked past him without breaking stride. Her shoulders were level. Her breathing was controlled. Her eyes fixed straight ahead as if he was invisible, as if he was background noise. The kind of calm that comes not from weakness but from having already survived worse. The kind of composure that made Caldwell's stomach tighten, because it meant she wasn't broken. It meant something about her response was wrong, was off, was not what he'd expected. He watched her disappear around the corner. The security officers followed. The hallway fell silent except for the distant beeping of monitors and the hiss of air through ventilation grates. 3 hours later, Laura sat at her kitchen table with her head in her hands. Her daughter, Emma, 6 years old and still wearing her school uniform, stood in the kitchen doorway with confusion written across her small face. The afternoon light was failing. The house felt too quiet. Mommy. Emma's voice was small, uncertain. Why are you home early? Is everything okay? Laura couldn't answer. Not with words. Not with an explanation that a 6-year-old could understand. She couldn't say, because I saved someone's life and it blew my cover. Because the man I was investigating just made sure nobody in this hospital will ever hire me. Because I've spent 6 months building a nursing identity that protected a Navy captain, and now that's all burning. Because I have 17 days left on this assignment and I just destroyed it in 43 seconds of instinct. She pulled Emma close instead, pressing her daughter's head against her chest. Emma's small hand reached up and patted her mother's shoulder, the way Laura had done for her when she had nightmares. The role reversed. The child comforting the soldier. On the kitchen table, beside a half-eaten apple and Emma's homework, sat the pair of worn combat boots from Marjah. Desert tan leather, creased and scarred. Laces frayed at the ends. The soles worn thin from 214 combat patrols. She'd pulled them from her locker, the only personal item she kept from before, the only tangible thing that proved the other Laura actually existed. The one who wasn't a nurse. The one who carried different weights. Laura sat there in the fading light, her daughter pressed against her, and looked at those boots. Looked at the cracks in the leather. The dust that would never fully wash out. The history embedded in the material. She thought about Captain Reynolds, still in that hospital bed. Still alive because she'd made the choice to save him instead of protect her mission. Still breathing because she'd chosen duty over assignment, humanity over strategy. Your hands are shaking, Emma whispered. Laura looked down. Her daughter was right. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. The physical manifestation of everything she was holding down. Anger at Caldwell. Frustration at herself. Grief at the operation collapsing. She released the tremor slowly, let it dissipate through her shoulders, and forced her breathing into the familiar pattern. For counts in. Hold for 4. For counts out. The technique they taught you in selection. The one that kept you functional when everything was burning. It's okay, baby, she finally said. Mommy's just having a difficult day. Emma didn't understand. How could she? This 6-year-old understood school, understood cartoons, understood that when Mommy was home, it usually meant ice cream and movies. She didn't understand that her mother had just watched 6 months of work dissolve in the span of 90 seconds. That the man she was supposed to be monitoring was still in danger. That her career, the civilian one she'd built so carefully as cover complete with references and credentials and employment history, was about to be systematically dismantled by a man with a phone and a vendetta. Laura reached for the combat boots. She picked them up, held them for a moment. The leather was cold. The weight was familiar. She thought about throwing them away. About burning them, about washing her hands of everything they represented. About becoming fully Laura Bennett, night shift nurse, and letting Master Chief Petty Officer Laura Bennett slip into the past where she belonged. Then she heard it. Distant at first. A low rumble that didn't belong to Houston evening traffic. The sound grew louder, more focused. The distinctive rotation of helicopter rotors cutting through the sky. Not one. Multiple. The windows rattled slightly. The fluorescent kitchen light swayed on its chain. Emma's eyes went wide. "Mommy, what is that?" Laura stood slowly, still holding the boots. The sound was becoming impossible to ignore. The rotor wash was audible now, so close that the house itself seemed to vibrate. Emergency services didn't send multiple helicopters to residential neighborhoods in Houston for traffic accidents. They didn't send them to schools or homes. They sent them for one reason: active military operations. Extraction. Insertion. Emergency response. She looked out the kitchen window. 3 black SUVs were pulling up to the curb outside her house. Not police. Not medical. The window tint was too dark, the silhouettes too deliberate. They moved with synchronized precision. Following the vehicles came something larger, the shadow of a transport helicopter descending toward the street itself, rotors creating wind tunnels that bent the trees sideways. Laura's hand tightened on the combat boots. She set them down gently on the table beside Emma's homework, and her voice, when she spoke, had shifted. The tired nurse was gone. What remained was something older, something sharper. "Emma, go upstairs to your room. Lock the door. Don't come out unless I call for you." "But Mommy." "Now, sweetheart." Emma didn't question it. Children recognize certain tones of voice. Survival instinct. She disappeared up the stairs, and Laura heard the click of the bedroom lock. The front door hadn't been knocked on yet. The SUVs were still pulling up. The helicopter was still descending. But in that moment of silence before it all arrived, Laura Bennett picked up those combat boots and held them against her chest, and for the first time in 6 months, the undercover nurse allowed herself to breathe like a soldier. 24 hours later, the rotor wash arrived before the vehicles did. 3 black SUVs pulled onto Maple Street at 6:56 a.m., their engines cutting to silence as a transport helicopter descended toward the asphalt, the blades churning the morning air into submission. Laura was still in her kitchen, still holding those boots, when the sound made her daughter press her face against the window. A Marine officer stepped out of the lead vehicle before the rotors had fully stopped, his dress uniform crisp as a surgical incision, his jaw moving with the kind of calm that comes from giving orders that kill men and save them in equal measure. He walked to her door without hesitation. Knocked once. When she opened it, his eyes found hers and held them for exactly 2 seconds. "Master Chief Petty Officer Bennett. We're here for Reaper 6. Not a question. Not even a request. A statement of operational fact." Her daughter watched her mother hand her a juice box, whisper that she'd be back soon, and step toward the helicopter without looking back. The boot stayed on the kitchen table. At St. Michael's Hospital, the conference room on the 4th floor had floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Houston's skyline, and Dr. Caldwell sat at the head of a mahogany table with his lawyer beside him, the kind of attorney who cost $800 an hour and smiled like a man who'd never lost. The hospital administrator, Margaret Chen, had called the emergency meeting herself, her voice neutral over the phone, which should have been Caldwell's first warning. Instead, he'd arrived smiling. Board members filled the chairs. His phone had buzzed 3 times in the past hour, surgical representatives calling to confirm their payoffs were still coming, kickback schemes running like well-oiled machinery for 7 years now. Nobody had ever looked too hard. Nobody had ever cared. The door opened and a Navy Rear Admiral walked in, his uniform carrying 5 ribbons that represented 32 years of combat decisions, flanked by 2 armed security personnel whose hands rested on their duty belts with the casual readiness of people who would use them. The Admiral did not shake hands. He did not sit down. He opened a folder and began to speak, his voice carrying the texture of steel sliding across stone. "We're here for Master Chief Petty Officer Laura Bennett. Her cover was compromised when she performed an unauthorized procedure 72 hours ago. The procedure saved Captain Reynolds' life. The procedure also triggered a counterintelligence review of this facility." The room went dead silent. Margaret Chen's eyes widened. Caldwell's face shifted, his lawyer's hand moving to his briefcase with the speed of someone sensing a predator nearby. The Admiral continued without pause, reading from a classified file. Bronze Star for Valor, Marjah Province, 2019. He paused, let that land. The security guard standing near the door, Martinez, the one who'd escorted Laura out, went pale, his breath catching audibly. Silver Star, same deployment. Another pause. Longer this time. 2 Purple Hearts, one for shrapnel wounds sustained while executing emergency extraction, and one from subsequent IED strike. The board members were completely motionless. Caldwell's lawyer leaned over to whisper something, but the doctor wasn't listening anymore. The Admiral's voice dropped another octave, the kind of volume that fills spaces without effort. Over 40 confirmed combat medical saves in hostile territory. Combat medic certified by the Defense Medical Readiness Training Institute. And currently assigned to this hospital under classified directive to investigate procurement fraud connected to medical supply contracts. Captain Reynolds stood then, leaning on a walker that had been positioned at the back of the room, his naval dress blues crisp as November wind. When he spoke, his voice carried the rasp of a man who'd spent 2 weeks in an ICU bed. "She died twice getting me out of a firefight in Sanjin Valley. Took shrapnel that was meant for my chest. Again." He looked directly at Caldwell. "And she saved my life again 3 days ago when everyone in this room was too panicked to function. So whatever you're about to say, Doctor, I'd think about whose uniform carries more weight." 10 seconds passed. The fluorescent panels above hummed their mechanical rhythm. Nobody moved. The Admiral closed his folder and turned toward Caldwell, his expression the kind of calm that precedes catastrophe. "The investigation you initiated into Master Chief Bennett's credentials triggered our full counterintelligence review of your department. We found fraudulent billing records dating back 7 years. We found kickback agreements with Sunrise Medical Supply totaling $847,000. We found evidence you overbilled the Veterans Administration for procedures never performed on 17 different patients." Caldwell stood up. His hands were shaking. His lawyer grabbed his arm, but the doctor yanked away, his composure cracking like porcelain under pressure. "This is insane. She's the one who, she was the threat. She was investigating me. I was protecting this hospital's," his voice cracked. Actually cracked. The room felt the shift immediately, the moment a man realized his network was disconnected, his favors were void, his carefully constructed arrangement was collapsing in real time with federal authority watching it happen. The Admiral didn't even blink. "You were protecting your profit margin, Doctor. That protection ends now. You're being placed under federal investigation for healthcare fraud, conspiracy to defraud the Veterans Administration, and falsification of medical records. You will surrender your credentials to this hospital effective immediately. Your license has been suspended pending the outcome of proceedings." Caldwell's lawyer was already standing, already talking, already trying to salvage something from the wreckage. But the doctor wasn't listening. He was looking at the faces around the table, the board members who'd accepted his invitations to his lake house, who'd taken his money for their campaign contributions, who were now looking at him with the kind of distance that comes when people realize a predator was in their midst. Margaret Chen stood up. "Security, escort Dr. Caldwell from the building." He moved toward the door, his gait unsteady, his surgeon's hands, the hands that had earned $340,000 a year, hanging empty at his sides. Before he reached the threshold, he turned back and pointed at the Admiral, his voice dropping into something desperate and ugly. "She sabotaged me. She planted evidence. I can prove," but the Admiral had already turned away, already discussing the scope of the investigation with Margaret Chen as though Caldwell had ceased to exist. The door closed behind the doctor. His lawyer followed. And in the conference room, Captain Reynolds sat back down, exhaled slowly, and let himself smile for the first time since his surgery. A year passed. Seasons shifted in Houston like a held breath finally released. Dr. Caldwell's medical license was revoked. Federal charges proceeded through the courts with the inexorable grinding of justice machinery. His assets were frozen pending restitution. His house was sold to cover the settlement. Someone spotted him on a Tuesday afternoon outside a strip mall in the south part of the city, setting up a folding table with supplemental insurance pamphlets, his name tag reading Steve instead of Dr. Caldwell, his hand still remembering the weight of a scalpel but now arranging brochures for people passing by without recognition. His face flinched every time someone called him doctor out of habit, the muscle memory of a title he no longer owned. Inside St. Michael's, though, something different was taking root. The main corridor on the second floor now featured a bronze plaque with an inscription that caught light from the window above it, the Laura Bennett Cardiac Unit, dedicated to Master Chief Petty Officer Laura Bennett, Naval Medical Service Corps, in recognition of extraordinary service to the men and women entrusted to our care. Beside the plaque hung a glass case, climate-controlled and secured with the kind of reverence reserved for reliquaries. Inside sat a pair of combat boots, weathered and scarred, their leather creased from desert heat, the laces still tied with the precision of someone who'd worn them through fire. A small brass nameplate beneath them read, Marjah Province, 2019. Worn in service. Laura returned to St. Michael's 3 weeks after the Admiral left. Not as a night shift nurse investigating a patient. She came back as herself, Master Chief Petty Officer Laura Bennett, offered the position of Director of Trauma Operations, her salary tripled, her authority absolute, her credibility undeniable. She refused the office on the administrative floor. Instead, she kept her locker in the nurse station on the second floor, kept her shift times at night, and showed up in her scrubs like she'd never left, moving between beds with the same methodical attention that had nearly destroyed Dr. Caldwell because it was simply who she was. A patient coding at 2:13 a.m. would find her already there, her hand steady, her voice cutting through panic like a knife through silk. Young nurses would watch her work and understand, in ways they couldn't quite articulate, that they were standing near someone who'd held lives together under conditions that would shatter ordinary people. And she would finish the save, check the vitals, make sure the monitors were stable, and return to her charting without commentary or drama. One evening, a Navy lieutenant who'd been assigned to debrief her on the investigation findings came by the hospital with flowers he didn't know how to explain. He left them on her desk before she arrived. She found them there at 11:53 p.m., set them in a cup of water from the break room sink, and returned to work. He showed up the next night. And the next. They never spoke about it directly. Just the flowers. The quiet presence. The way she smiled when she saw him, so small you'd miss it if you weren't looking for it. Some stories don't need more than that. The hospital commissioned a new pediatric trauma wing 3 months later, funded by federal grants and private donation, and staffed it with nurses who'd trained under Laura's eye. The Veterans Administration started funneling its Houston area cases to St. Michael's specifically because of her reputation. Board members who'd accepted Caldwell's favors were quietly asked to resign. The procurement department was audited top to bottom, and its leadership replaced with people who understood that profit margins meant nothing if they were built on lies. Laura stood in the hallway outside the new wing at its dedication ceremony, watching doctors and administrators and donors shuffle through the space, and someone asked her if she was proud. She was quiet for a long moment, her eyes on a young woman wearing an Army combat medic badge, watching her with undisguised awe. "Pride's a luxury," Laura said finally. "What matters is they know the difference between looking and seeing. Between hearing and listening. Between being competent and being trustworthy." The young medic moved closer, asking if she could talk about training opportunities. Laura nodded, gestured toward a quiet corner, and sat down to listen, because that was the work now. Not the surgeries, though those happened. Not the investigations, though her name still appeared on classified reports. The work was here, in the slow, ordinary act of teaching others to notice what Caldwell had banked on them missing. The trembling wasn't fear anymore. It was the weight of knowing exactly what lives depended on, and choosing to hold that space for everyone who walked through these doors. The boots remained in their case. The plaque remained polished. And every single night, a Master Chief Petty Officer in a set of blue scrubs showed up at work and did exactly what she'd always done, paid attention. Noticed what others overlooked. Saved the people everyone else had already written off. True class is what you do when the lights go out. If you've ever been underestimated the way Laura was, or if you've ever judged someone only to discover you were completely wrong about who they were, drop a comment below. Subscribe for more stories about the quiet warriors among us. And hit that notification bell because next time, we're telling a story that starts with a phone call at midnight that changes everything.